Bun găsit, doamnelor și domnilor, sunt Marius Constantinescu, iar vizualul nostru de astăzi este unul eminamente artistic. Mai mult decât atât, ne face să baleăm între colecționismul britanic de tradiție și unul dintre cele mai ambițioase spații dedicate artei contemporane din sud-estul Europei, cu șarm și know-how. Dacă știați, vă confirm, dacă nu știați, aflați acum. Am dintotdeauna o fascinație pentru colecțiile de artă britanice, cu cât mai mici și mai retrase, cu atât mai bogate în exponate prețioase. Ca atare a fost o șansă nesperată pentru mine această discuție pe Zoom pe care vă propun mai departe cu istoricul de artă David Taylor, fost curator șef al Departamentului Pictură și Sculptură al National Trust United Kingdom.
We had these very, very fine collections, and that goes from the Royal Collection and the National Collections and the City Collections. But we also have the phenomena of the Country House Collection in the British Isles, which in a way is quite a unique resource for us. And I think in many ways, because we've had no major large-scale revolution in the British Isles, no sort of major regime change, that these elite collections have survived through the centuries. And you can often find quite small houses, which, like you say, will have fantastic masterpieces, amongst the usual family pictures of horses and dogs and things. And I think there's an element of that. We've had a very sort of rich and powerful upper class since the 16th century, and part of their display of their wealth and their taste and sort of showing off was to have art, was to display pictures and sculpture in their houses. So I think that's why we have these collections, which have these amazing surprises in them.
Back in the 18th century, there has been a certain fashion among British upper class, which is taking the grand tour. I mean, going to Italy, spending at least a few months there, getting into contact with everything that Italy had to offer in art excellence, from Venice up to Rome and Naples, and then coming back to Britain with certain collections, with certain possessions.
That's right. I mean, you're right. It was upper class, mostly men, who traveled to the continent. Usually, the majority of them went to Italy or just went to Italy. And they didn't just buy art, which they then brought back to the British Isles. They saw and they absorbed the art around them. So they were very influenced by architecture, by city planning, by formal gardens and so on. So then they came back hugely important patrons in future years and influenced art back in the British Isles, influenced landscape design, if you think of Capability Brand, or
of course,
influenced the huge love of neoclassicism in the British Isles, a British version of what was seen in Italy. So,
would you say there has been a certain pattern in assembling an art collection? Because if we take, for example, probably the best known art collection in the country, which is the National Gallery in London, we see that every major European school is represented, and is represented by some of its best examples.
Yes, that's right. I mean, it's one of a few collections like that, and they're lucky in the National Gallery because it's a relatively large building, so it's not a very heavy display. You can really look at each work as you go around. But it's actually not a huge collection. It's only about 2,500 paintings, and obviously, like most galleries, they're not all on show. And again, it's interesting because it's not based on a royal collection like a lot of national collections around the world. So they've had this sort of elite collecting represented, like you say, by all the major schools, most of the major artists. And what's quite interesting interesting now, I think just as a visitor, is the National Gallery now looking to American painters and Australian painters. So, you know, in the future decades, it's going to become even more encyclopedic as a collection of the Western canon, you know, of art.
David Taylor este expert în portretistica secolelor al XVI-lea și al XVII-lea și în egală măsură vorbește cu entuziasm și pasiune despre artă. Grație intuiției lui, corpusul atât de select al autoportretelor lui Rembrandt s-a îmbogățit cu o nouă lucrare, pentru că în 2014, pornind de la ipoteza lui, tabloul aflat astăzi și expus la Buckland Abbey a fost confirmat drept autograf de către toți experții mondiali în domeniu.
The picture was in a private collection in England. People that had a very fine collection of Dutch and Flemish pictures. And the attribution had gone back and forward. We know it's a portrait of Rembrandt because he painted it himself so often we know what he looked like. But we didn't know if he painted it or if one of his pupils painted it. And in the 60s, the Rembrandt Research Project looked at it in this private collection, decided it wasn't by Rembrandt. But one of the younger people in that team later became the director of the Rembrandt Research Project and the world expert on Rembrandt, Professor Ernst van der Vettering. And several years ago, he decided actually the Buckland picture, it had come to the National Trust since then, was probably by him. And because of the advances in technical analysis, we decided that we would send it to the Hamilton Carr Institute at Cambridge University. And it underwent about 8 or 9 months of technical analysis. It was x-rayed, did dendrochronology on the timber that it was painted on, and all the evidence at the end suggested that Professor van der Vettering was right, and it was this 1635 signed and dated Rembrandt self-portrait. So we're very lucky. It's a wonderful picture. It was a wonderful picture.
It is beautiful, right.
Yeah, and it's a trony, so it's one of those Dutch 17th century very fashionable pictures, which it's Rembrandt, but he's not necessarily presenting himself as the artist Rembrandt. He's a character. You know, he has a gorget from a suit of armor around his throat. He's got a funny sort of timeless costume. So yeah, it's a really wonderful picture.
Which one would you say that is one of the most underrated British collections in spite of its value?
Well, I think there are a few, I think, underrated British collections, but one of my favourites, which I definitely think is underrated, is the Kelvin Grove Art Gallery and Museum in Glasgow.
In Glasgow, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's a wonderful. Just the art collection alone, they have Rembrandt's.
Beautiful Rembrandt, yes.
Oh, fantastic! His son in the suit of armour. It's a magical picture, and it's an interesting collection. So it was formed in the 19th century with the growth of the sort of merchant classes in Glasgow, people that had suddenly become very rich and wanted to spend their money to, again, a bit like the grand tourist, to display their taste and wealth. And the collection was born from those times, and it's wonderful. And Kelvin Grove is very interesting because the Glaswegians, the people of Glasgow, have a real connection with it, and they have a real sense of ownership about the collection. And I think other cities in Britain would love to have that feeling between the citizens and the collection. But it's a magical place, and anyone listening, if you're ever in Scotland, do go to Kelvin Grove. It's wonderful.
And I think they also manage Pollock House, right?
Yes.
Where one can find one of the most beautiful feminine portraits in all art history, formerly attributed to El Greco, now Alonso Sanchez Coelho, the lady in the fur wrap. And also, if I think back to my visit to Kelvin Grove Museum, they not only have exquisite paintings, they have applied art, sculpture, costume, everything. I mean, it's a small museum, but an encyclopedic one.
It really is, and I'm glad you mentioned Pollock House. Very fine, small but very fine Spanish collection, including the lady in the fur wrap, which, you know, it's one of those paintings. No matter how many times you stand in front of it, it's mesmerizing.
Would there be a national school best represented in the British collections?
Well, I think when you asked about the Grand Tour, that I mean, we have a lot of very good Italian pictures, and like I say, despite the fact that a lot of these collectors were Protestant, they were also buying Catholic art. So religious art suddenly became very fashionable. A lot of really fantastic Dutch and Flemish, but particularly Dutch pictures in the British Isles. And I think that maybe goes back to a sort of affinity between Britons and people from the Netherlands, and a lot of people from the Low Countries came over to Scotland and England in the 16th and 17th century to paint. A lot of our sort of best art, if you think of portraits, especially the British always loved portraits, were painted in the early modern period by people from the Low Countries. And sometimes they came over to paint other things, like Peter Lely. He came over to paint subject pictures and then realized, actually, if he wanted to make money, he was working in London, he had to paint portraits, and then became one of our most successful and celebrated portraitists. As you know, Marius, I worked on an exhibition about Dutch masterpieces from National Trust houses several years ago, and we were very lucky because we had 3 venues, and our international venue was the Maurits House in The Hague. And we had a wonderful relationship with our colleagues there, and they were very, very excited about the exhibition because of the quality of the art. But there were certain pictures they really wanted to show to a Dutch audience. Albert Cuyp of A View of Dordrecht, and Cuyp was a fantastic artist, but there's not many sort of A1 Cuyps left in the Netherlands because he wasn't that popular at the time. But in England, he was collected massively. Last year, I co-curated an exhibition at Tate in London on British Baroque art, and it was the first time that subject had been looked at on its own in a sort of major exhibition.
Indeed, because if we think about British paintings, we think about the late 18th century and, of course, the 19th century.
Exactly.
În 2012, David Taylor a fost numit curator șef al Departamentului Pictură și Sculptură al National Trust UK, post de mare responsabilitate pentru că în patrimoniul National Trust UK, la momentul acela, se aflau peste 13.500 de tablouri prețioase.
One picture I really love from the National Trust collection is there were several Velázquez pictures, but there's one really fine picture by Velázquez of the heir to the Spanish throne, Prince Baltasar Carlos, and it's at Ickworth House.
Yes.
And he's age 6. It's very informal. He's out hunting. He's in the mountains west of Madrid. It's a very dreary autumn day. He's got some dogs around him. And this was this much desired son for Philip IV, and who was very sadly died when he was 16 of smallpox. But it was one of a set of pictures of the royal family hunting. And they're very informal because they were painted not for the palace in Madrid, but for a little hunting lodge in the mountains. And it's a well-known image because there's another version in the Prado, which people know, but the National Trust one was the first painting. So that's a favorite. But there's also other things, like we had when I was at the National Trust, there was a fantastic little 1961 Max Ernst tiny little painting of a scallop shell. So that's a magical thing. That's a favorite picture too.
I believe when you've been previously asked the same question, you have also mentioned the Kingston Lacy Titian, which ranks among my personal favorites. Yes, yeah. That beautiful portrait.
The Kingston Lacy Titian of Nicola Zen. It's just it's a fantastic picture. And I know colleagues, just before I left the National Trust, were working on a potential there's several Titians in the National Trust collection. We're very lucky. But there's another picture which is sort of attributed to him, which may actually be a Titian as well. And I know that work is ongoing, so watch this space, Marius.
Would you say that modern art history and studies have helped one or more particular artist or artists to regain a widespread and larger audience?
I think feminism and feminist art history has been hugely important. And I was thinking that because I was looking at some notes the other day, and I was thinking about the very, very popular exhibition at the National Gallery last year in London on Artemisia Gentileschi.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I think that is a sort of the way we look at and talk about female artists now as being hugely helped by the feminist art history movement. And it's really readdressed the balance, because someone like Artemisia Gentileschi, was looked at decades ago as being sort of on the sideline, whereas now we see her as a major painter. We know that she had a very interesting and at times very tragic life, but now we can look at her as an artist in her own right and really sort of re-look at her place in art history.
David, the last year we've seen our lives changing in every aspect of them. Would you say that for the future time there will be a shift, a change as well in our attitude, in our relationship towards the institution of the museum, towards the collection, towards an exhibition and everything that comes around it?
As people have spent a lot of time on their own sometimes, or with their families, they have felt very sort of devolved from, very separate from culture if they haven't got access to it. So I think now that things are beginning to ease from various stages of lockdown, people will want to engage with and experience culture in a way that they might not have done before. Now that might be a matter of just doing more of it, going to museums more than they did before. But I think people will also want things from museums that maybe they didn't offer before. And I think they'll want to be able to feel more of a connection between the collections, that they're not just going there to be told a story, that actually they have that it's a conversation between the visitor and the interpretation and the way that the exhibitions and the permanent displays are actually displayed for visitors. So I think museums will have to think very hard about how they show their works and what sort of exhibitions they put on in the future. But when they do that, I think the relationship is going to be really strong because people will want to go there more.
Hopefully. Well, David, thank you so much. It's been great.
Well, mulțumesc.
Cu multă plăcere. Wow!
La momentul deschiderii sale, în 2001, era considerat cel mai ambițios spațiu dedicat artei contemporane din sud-estul Europei. Colecția de artă permanentă este una redutabilă, dar ce îi dă cu adevărat vibrație și dinamism este succesiunea expozițiilor temporare. Andreea Duță astăzi ne duce la Muzeul Național de Artă Contemporană.
Fondat în 2001, Muzeul Național de Artă Contemporană este cel mai mare spațiu dedicat artei contemporane din România. NAC promovează nume relevante de artiști români și străini. În anul 2004, muzeul se stabilește în Palatul Parlamentului. Deși trecut prin perioade de schimbări economice și politice dese, muzeul a evoluat, răspunzând astăzi provocărilor pe care le ridică muzeografia secolului 21.
NAC este o instituție puternic ancorată în orașul București, care are un program foarte clar structurat de revitalizare a câtorva zone urbane unde are sediile sale. NAC este foarte atent la problematica socială și a diverselor minorități de ordin etnic, de gen, economice, pe care România și Bucureștiul le au. Și considerăm că este datoria noastră să încercăm să atragem aceste minorități și aceste categorii marginale ca public al muzeului, fiindcă asta este o adevărată notă de normalitate. Și muzeul este, sigur, foarte implicat în ceea ce era așteptat de la noi de câteva decenii bune, și anume configurarea unui corpus de evenimente culturale, expoziții și publicații care să constituie în sfârșit canonul istoriei recente artei din România.
Muzeul are 4 etaje cu peste 7.000 de lucrări de artă contemporană și 2 sezoane expoziționale anuale. Pe peretele scării interioare admirăm lucrarea de 500 de metri pătrați în graffiti Urban Steps. Există și un spațiu cu acces gratuit pentru coworking și lectură în incinta Bibliotecii Oroveanu, aflată la parter. Spațiul este deschis comunității creative, deține aproximativ 6.000 de volume, colecții de diapozitive și negative și o editură dedicată documentării fenomenului contemporan. Aici se pregătește tipărirea a 4 monografii ce vor purta logo-ul aniversar.
Sigur că lucrăm cu istoria orală și căutăm să colectăm pe cât se poate mărturii, amintiri, cum să zic eu, narrative documentare de la actuali și foști angajați ai muzeului. Aceste mărturii, pe de o parte, vor deveni o secțiune importantă a fondului nostru documentar. Pe de altă parte, ele vor fi sigur accesibile publicului pe site-ul muzeului și pe canalele de social media.
O importantă realizare este și expoziția permanentă a colecției MNAC, care ilustrează evoluțiile artelor vizuale din România între 1960 și 2018. Muzeul a dedicat cel mai generos spațiu acestei expoziții vii, ce se transformă organic în fiecare an.
Colecțiile nu înseamnă doar artă, pictură, sculptură, video, etc. Colecțiile înseamnă un fond extrem de important și de masiv de documente originale, de dosare de artiști, de fotografii, negative, diapozitive, de publicații. Noi privim acest fond documentar și colecțiile de artă vizuală propriu-zise ca pe un tot și le tratăm ca atare. Ne propunem să schimbăm radical peisajul curatorial de la etajul 1 al muzeului, având în vedere că asta este o expoziție care a durat deja aproape 5 ani și că noi credem că și-a îndeplinit scopul de a atrage atenția asupra diversității colecțiilor muzeului, pe de o parte, și pe de altă parte asupra legăturii indestructibile dintre istoria socială, politică și economică a României și istoria ei culturală, pentru că asta este de fapt miza centrală a expoziției Văzând Istoria.
Dezvoltând un program amplu de recuperare istorică a culturii vizuale din România, MNAC ocupă în prezent o poziție centrală în modelarea memoriei culturale și vine în sprijinul talentelor tinere. Anul acesta, muzeul aniversează 20 de ani de la înființare și va organiza evenimente on și offline dedicate rolului muzeelor în contextul schimbărilor globale, lansări, expoziții, tururi ghidate și ateliere aplicate de istoria artei.
E nevoie ca arta să fie apărată? Sunt convins că este nevoie de asta. Este producția artistică o armă? Aici am niște rezerve. În general nu subscriu la tendințele actuale care consideră că artiștii, creatorii în general trebuie să se ocupe de marile urgențe ale momentului, fie ele de ordin politic sau de ordin social. Arta este autonomă, arta nu poate rezista decât dacă se uită la propriul ei mesaj. Iar mesajul artei este despre sine, nu despre altceva.
Doamnelor, domnilor, Vizual la final. Sunt Marius Constantinescu, mă găsiți și pe Facebook și Instagram, iar aici la Verso Cărturești, pe TVR3 și TVRplus.ro, ne revedem sâmbătă viitoare la 20 și 30 de minute. Până atunci, priviți în jur!